The dust swirled in miniature tornadoes across the empty platform as the locomotive's whistle echoed one final time through Willowbrook Valley before disappearing around the bend. Grace Hartwell stood alone on the weathered wooden planks, clutching a battered leather suitcase in one arm and a makeshift wooden crate in the other. From within the crate came an indignant squawk, followed by the scratching of claws against splintered pine. The August heat pressed down like a heavy blanket, making her traveling dress cling uncomfortably to her skin. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Sweat beaded on her forehead as she surveyed the desolate train station, nothing more than a crude platform and a tiny ticket booth that appeared to have been abandoned for weeks. The promised station master was nowhere to be found, and the welcome party she'd been assured would meet her was conspicuously absent. Emma set down her burdens and opened the crate's lid slightly, peering inside at her unusual traveling companion. A russet-colored hen with bright amber eyes glared back at her, balancing awkwardly on her single remaining leg. The bird's left leg had been lost to a fox attack back in Philadelphia, but her fierce spirit had remained intact. "Well, Penelope," Emma whispered to the hen, "it appears we've been abandoned once again." The irony wasn't lost on her. Just 3 months ago, she'd stood on another platform in Philadelphia, watching her intended husband board a westbound train with his new bride, a woman with a substantial dowry and social connections Emma could never match. The humiliation had been crushing, made worse by the pitying looks from neighbors who'd witnessed her public disgrace. The letters had started arriving 2 weeks later. Not love letters or apologies, but something far more intriguing. Her great-aunt Cordelia, whom Emma had never met, had apparently passed away and left her a peculiar inheritance, a homestead claim in Willowbrook, Colorado, along with instructions to find the truth about what really happened to your great-uncle Theodore. The suitcase beside her feet contained nearly 200 letters, correspondence between Cordelia and various people throughout the territory, each one hinting at a mystery that had consumed the old woman's final years. Theodore Hartwell had vanished without a trace 25 years ago, leaving behind only questions and a half-built ranch that had eventually been abandoned. Emma had sold everything she owned to fund the journey west, keeping only her most precious possessions: her mother's china tea set, a few changes of clothes, her father's medical journals, and Penelope, the only living creature who'd shown her loyalty when the rest of Philadelphia society had turned their backs. Now, as she stood in the oppressive heat with no sign of civilization beyond the empty platform, Emma wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake. The inheritance letter had mentioned that someone from the Hartwell ranch would meet her at the station, but the platform stretched empty in both directions. A cloud of dust on the horizon caught her attention. As it grew closer, she could make out a rider approaching at a steady pace. Hope flickered in her chest. Perhaps her ride had simply been delayed. She smoothed her traveling dress and tried to look more composed than she felt. The rider resolved into a tall man astride a paint horse, his broad-brimmed hat shadowing his features. As he drew nearer, Emma could see he was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 30 years old, with sun-weathered skin and the easy grace of someone who'd spent his entire life in the saddle. His clothes were practical rather than fashionable: worn leather chaps, a faded blue shirt, and boots that had seen countless miles of rough terrain. He slowed his horse as he approached the platform, his dark eyes taking in Emma's appearance with undisguised curiosity. She noticed he had the kind of face that might have been considered handsome, if not for the wariness that seemed permanently etched into his features. "You wouldn't happen to be waiting for someone from the Hartwell place, would you?" he asked, his voice carrying a distinctive Western drawl that Emma found oddly comforting. Relief flooded through her. "Yes, I'm Emma Hartwell. Are you from the ranch?" The man's expression shifted, surprise replacing the cautious interest. "Hartwell?" He dismounted in one fluid motion, standing a full head taller than Emma's modest height. "I'm afraid there's been some confusion, ma'am. The Hartwell ranch has been empty for nigh on 20 years. Emma's heart sank. "But I received a letter. I inherited the property from my great-aunt Cordelia. Someone was supposed to meet me here and take me to the homestead." The stranger removed his hat, revealing thick brown hair that caught the afternoon sunlight. "Name's Daniel McReynolds. I own the spread adjacent to what used to be the Hartwell place." He studied her with genuine concern. "Miss, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but that old homestead's nothing more than a few crumbling walls and a lot of prairie grass now. Emma felt the world tilt slightly beneath her feet. She'd gambled everything on this inheritance: her savings, her reputation, her future. The thought of returning to Philadelphia in defeat, facing the smug satisfaction of those who'd predicted her failure, made her stomach clench with dread. "There must be some mistake," she said, reaching into her suitcase and producing a folded document. "I have the deed right here. Cordelia Hartwell left me 40 acres and a dwelling." Daniel accepted the paper and examined it carefully, his brow furrowing as he read. "This appears legitimate," he admitted, "but ma'am, I've been ranching this valley for 8 years now, and I can tell you there's nothing livable at the old Hartwell place." An indignant squawk from the crate interrupted their conversation. Daniel's eyes widened as he noticed the makeshift cage for the first time. "What in tarnation do you have in there?" Emma opened the crate's lid fully, revealing Penelope in all her one-legged glory. The hen fixed Daniel with a baleful stare, as if holding him personally responsible for their current predicament. "This is Penelope," Emma said with as much dignity as she could muster. "She's a Philadelphia Red, quite rare, actually. She lost her leg in an unfortunate encounter with a fox, but she's remarkably adaptable." Daniel stared at the bird, then at Emma, then back at the bird. "You brought a one-legged chicken to Colorado Territory?" "She's an excellent layer," Emma defended, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. "And she's been my constant companion since I lost everything else." Something in her tone must have conveyed more than she intended, because Daniel's expression softened slightly. He studied her face, taking in the determined set of her jaw despite the obvious exhaustion and disappointment in her eyes. "Miss Hartwell," he said carefully, "I don't mean to pry, but what exactly brought you all the way out here? With respect, you don't strike me as the homesteading type." Emma bristled at the implication. "And what type would that be, Mr. McReynolds?" "The type that can survive a Colorado winter in a canvas tent while building a cabin from scratch," he replied bluntly. "No offense intended, but your hands don't show calluses, and that traveling dress wasn't made for ranch work." She wanted to argue, to prove him wrong, but the truth was undeniable. She'd lived a sheltered life in Philadelphia, her most strenuous activity being needlework or playing piano for church socials, but desperation had a way of making people braver than they actually were. "Perhaps not," she conceded, "but I'm a quick learner, and I have nowhere else to go." The admission hung in the air between them, more vulnerable than Emma had intended. Daniel's expression shifted again, and she saw something that might have been sympathy flicker in his dark eyes. "What's in the suitcase?" he asked, nodding toward her luggage. "If you don't mind my asking." Emma hesitated, then decided she had little left to lose. "Letters. Nearly 200 of them. My great-aunt spent years investigating what happened to her husband, Theodore Hartwell. He disappeared from this valley 25 years ago, and she never stopped looking for answers." Daniel went very still. "Theodore Hartwell," he repeated slowly. "You've heard of him?" "Every old-timer in the valley knows the story," Daniel said, his voice careful. "Theodore Hartwell was one of the first settlers here. Built a cabin, started a small ranch, then one day just vanished. Some folks thought he'd been killed by Ute war parties. Others figured he'd just given up and headed back east without telling anyone." "But you don't believe either of those theories," Emma observed, reading something in his expression. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting toward the mountains that rose like ancient sentinels beyond the valley floor. "My grandfather knew Theodore Hartwell. Said he was the most determined man he'd ever met. Not the type to give up easy, and too smart to get himself killed by Indians." "Then what happened to him?" "That's been the question for 25 years, Daniel replied. He looked back at Emma, and she saw a flicker of something. Curiosity, perhaps, or intrigue. "You really think those letters might have answers?" Emma nodded eagerly. Cordelia was systematic. She corresponded with everyone who might have known Theodore, other settlers, territorial officials, military personnel, traders. She was convinced something happened to him right here in this valley, something that somebody tried to cover up. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Daniel absorbed this information, his weathered face revealing nothing of his thoughts. Finally, he sighed and looked toward the western horizon where shadows were beginning to lengthen. "Miss Hartwell, it'll be dark in a few hours, and there's nowhere suitable for a lady to spend the night in Willowbrook. The hotel burned down 3 years ago, and the closest town with proper accommodations is 2 days' ride south." Emma's heart sank further. She'd exhausted her funds getting here and had no money for extended travel to find lodging. "However," Daniel continued, "I've got a bunkhouse at my ranch that's currently empty. My regular hands are up in the high pastures with the cattle for another 2 weeks. You and your chicken are welcome to stay there until we figure out what to do about your situation." The offer was generous, but Emma hesitated. Staying at a bachelor's ranch, even in separate quarters, would be scandalous by Philadelphia standards. Then again, she was no longer bound by Philadelphia's rigid social expectations. "That's very kind of you, Mr. McReynolds, but I couldn't impose." "It's not an imposition," he interrupted. "It's practical. You need shelter, and I've got an empty building. Besides," he added, with what might have been the ghost of a smile, "I'm curious about those letters. Been wondering about old Theodore's fate since I was knee-high to a grasshopper." Emma looked around at the empty platform, the endless expanse of prairie stretching in every direction, and the sun sinking steadily toward the mountains. Her choices were limited, and Daniel McReynolds, whatever his motives, seemed to be her only option. "Very well," she said, lifting her chin with what she hoped looked like confidence rather than desperation. "I accept your offer, but only temporarily, until I can assess the condition of my property and make proper arrangements." Daniel nodded, but Emma caught another flicker of that almost smile. "Of course, temporary." He moved toward his horse, then paused and looked back at her. "One question, though, Miss Hartwell. That chicken of yours, does she actually lay eggs?" Emma straightened proudly. "Penelope is an exceptional layer. Even with her handicap, she produces an egg nearly every day." "Good," Daniel said, swinging up into his saddle with easy grace, "because if she's going to eat my chicken feed, she'd better earn her keep." He rode over to where Emma stood with her luggage, then dismounted again and began securing her suitcase to his saddle. As he worked, Emma found herself studying his profile. There was something solid and dependable about Daniel McReynolds, a quality that reminded her of her father, a man who'd faced each day's challenges with quiet determination. "Mr. McReynolds," she said as he finished tying down her belongings, "why are you helping me? You don't know anything about me." Daniel paused, his hands still on the leather straps. When he looked at her, his expression was serious but not unkind. "Miss Hartwell, I've seen what this country does to people who aren't prepared for it. I've also seen what it can do for those who are willing to adapt." He gestured toward Penelope, who had settled into a more comfortable position in her crate. "That bird of yours lost a leg but kept on living. Takes a certain kind of spirit to do that." Emma felt an unexpected warmth spread through her chest at his words. It had been a long time since anyone had seen strength in her rather than weakness. "Besides," Daniel continued, mounting his horse again, "any woman brave enough to travel halfway across the country with nothing but a suitcase full of old letters and a one-legged chicken deserves a chance to prove what she's made of." He extended his hand down to her. "Can you ride?" Emma looked up at the tall horse, then at Daniel's outstretched hand. She'd ridden occasionally in Philadelphia's Fairmount Park, but always side-saddle on gentle mares with an instructor nearby. This paint horse looked considerably more challenging. "I can manage," she said, accepting his help up behind the saddle. "Hold on tight," Daniel advised as she settled herself as modestly as possible. "It's 5 miles to the ranch, and the trail gets rough in places." Emma wrapped her arms around his waist, acutely aware of the solid warmth of his body and the unfamiliar intimacy of their position. In Philadelphia, such contact would have been absolutely scandalous. Here, it seemed to be merely practical. As they rode away from the abandoned train platform, Emma looked back once at the spot where her new life had officially begun. Then she turned her attention forward, toward whatever awaited her at the McReynolds ranch. The landscape they traveled through was unlike anything Emma had ever seen. Rolling hills covered in golden grass stretched endlessly toward mountains that seemed to touch the sky. Occasional stands of cottonwood trees marked the presence of streams, and in the distance she could see small herds of cattle moving slowly across the range. "It's beautiful," she said, raising her voice to be heard over the steady rhythm of the horse's hooves. "It can be," Daniel agreed. "It can also be brutal. Winters here will test every bit of strength you've got, and summers can be just as harsh in their own way." "Are you trying to discourage me from staying?" Daniel was quiet for so long that Emma wondered if he'd heard her question. Finally, he spoke. "I'm trying to make sure you understand what you're getting into. This isn't Philadelphia, Miss Hartwell. Out here, mistakes can kill you." The bluntness of his statement sent a chill through Emma despite the warm afternoon air. She'd known, intellectually, that frontier life would be challenging, but she was beginning to realize how little she truly understood about the realities of survival in Colorado territory. "Tell me about Theodore Hartwell," she said, changing the subject to something that might be less intimidating. "What was he like?" Daniel guided the horse around a particularly rocky section of trail before answering. "From what my grandfather told me, Theodore was a dreamer with the backbone to make his dreams reality. He came west in 1853, staked his claim, and started building something permanent. Most of the early settlers were just passing through, looking for gold or trying to get to California. Theodore was different. He planned to stay." "What did he build?" "Started with a cabin, then added a barn and some corrals. My grandfather said Theodore had plans for a real ranch. Cattle, horses, maybe even some farming. He was always talking about bringing his wife out from back east once he got established." Emma's heart clenched. "He was married?" "Engaged, according to the stories. A young woman named Cordelia something or other. She was supposed to join him once he had a proper home built for her." The pieces began falling into place in Emma's mind. Cordelia Hartwell, her great-aunt, had been Theodore's fiancée, not his widow. She'd spent 25 years searching for answers about the man she'd loved and lost. "What happened to the ranch after he disappeared?" "Sat empty for a few years," Daniel said. "Eventually, the territorial government declared it abandoned and opened the land for new claims. By then, most of the buildings had fallen into disrepair. Weather's hard on wooden structures out here if nobody's maintaining them." They crested a hill, and Emma gasped at the view spread before them. A valley opened up below, green with irrigated pastures and dotted with buildings. A substantial ranch house sat in the center, built of logs and stone, with a wide porch that wrapped around two sides. Outbuildings scattered around it included barns, corrals, and what appeared to be a bunkhouse. "Welcome to the Lazy M," Daniel said, and Emma could hear the pride in his voice. As they descended into the valley, Emma found herself impressed by the obvious prosperity of Daniel's operation. Cattle grazed in fenced pastures, horses moved freely in large corrals, and everything appeared well-maintained and organized. "You built all this yourself?" she asked. "With some help," Daniel acknowledged. "Took me 8 years to get it to this point, and I'm still not finished. There's always something that needs building, or fixing, or improving." They reached the ranch yard, and Daniel dismounted before helping Emma down. Her legs were unsteady after the long ride, and she had to grip his arm for a moment to regain her balance. Penelope's crate had traveled well, secured behind the saddle, and the hen emerged looking ruffled but unharmed. "The bunkhouse is over there," Daniel said, pointing to a long, low building with several windows. "It's got 4 rooms, each with its own entrance. You can take your pick." Emma surveyed her temporary quarters with relief. The building appeared solid and well-maintained, a vast improvement over what she'd feared she might find at the abandoned Hartwell place. "What about Penelope?" she asked, holding the hen's crate. Daniel looked at the bird with amusement. "There's a chicken coop behind the main house. She can stay there with my other birds. Might do her good to have some company." "Other chickens?" Emma asked hopefully. "About 24 laying hens and a rooster named Caesar who thinks he runs the place." "Fair warning, Caesar's got opinions about newcomers." Emma laughed, the first genuine laugh she'd had since leaving Philadelphia. "Penelope has opinions too. They should get along splendidly." Daniel's expression softened at the sound of her laughter, and Emma caught a glimpse of the man behind the cautious exterior. There was humor there, and kindness, hidden beneath the practical reserve of someone who'd learned to be self-reliant. "Let's get you settled," he said, taking her suitcase from his saddle. "I'll show you where everything is, then leave you to rest. It's been a long day." The bunkhouse room Emma chose was simple but comfortable, with a narrow bed, a small table, and hooks on the wall for hanging clothes. A window looked out toward the mountains, and afternoon sunlight streamed across the wooden floor. "There's a pump behind the building for water," Daniel explained, "and an outhouse about 50 yards that way. If you need anything else, the main house is right over there. I'm usually up before dawn and in bed not long after sunset." Emma set Penelope's crate on the floor and opened it, allowing the hen to hop out and explore her new surroundings. The bird moved with surprising agility, despite her missing leg, pecking curiously at the wooden floor. "Mr. McReynolds," Emma said as Daniel prepared to leave, "I want you to know how grateful I am for your kindness. I realize this situation is unusual." Daniel paused in the doorway, his hat in his hands. "Miss Hartwell, can I ask you something?" "Of course. What are you really running from?" The question was asked gently, but it hit Emma like a physical blow. She'd thought she'd hidden her desperation better, but apparently Daniel McReynolds was more perceptive than she'd realized. "What makes you think I'm running from something? A lady doesn't travel alone to Colorado Territory with nothing but letters and a one-legged chicken unless she's got powerful reasons for leaving wherever she came from." Emma sank onto the bed, suddenly exhausted by the weight of maintaining her composure. "You're right," she admitted. "I am running. From humiliation, from pity, from a life that fell apart in the most public way possible." Daniel remained in the doorway, listening without judgment, as Emma found herself telling him things she'd never spoken aloud to anyone, about her broken engagement, her fiancé's betrayal, the social ostracism that had followed. "So when Cordelia's letter arrived with the inheritance," she concluded, "it seemed like Providence, a chance to start over somewhere no one knew about my failures." "And now you're discovering that starting over isn't as simple as changing locations," Daniel observed. "Exactly." Emma looked down at Penelope, who had settled contentedly in a patch of sunlight. "I'm beginning to think I may have made a terrible mistake." Daniel was quiet for a long moment, and when Emma looked up, she was surprised to see understanding rather than pity in his expression. "Miss Hartwell," he said finally, "tomorrow I'll take you to see what's left of the Hartwell place. After that, you can decide whether you want to stay and try to make something of it, or head back to wherever you came from. But tonight, you're safe. Your chicken has food and water, and that's enough for now." After he left, Emma sat in the gathering twilight, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch settling into evening quiet. Somewhere in the distance, cattle lowed softly, and she could hear the gentle murmur of chickens from the coop where Penelope was presumably getting acquainted with her new flock. For the first time since leaving Philadelphia, Emma allowed herself to truly consider what she'd undertaken. She was alone in a territory she didn't understand, dependent on the charity of a stranger, with no clear plan for survival. The smart thing, the safe thing, would be to admit her mistake and return east while she still had the train fare. But as she unpacked her suitcase and arranged her few belongings in the simple room, Emma found herself thinking about Daniel's words. Any woman brave enough to travel halfway across the country with nothing but a suitcase full of old letters and a one-legged chicken deserves a chance to prove what she's made of. Perhaps she was braver than she'd given herself credit for. Perhaps this strange inheritance and the mystery of Theodore Hartwell's disappearance had brought her exactly where she needed to be. Outside, the first stars were beginning to appear in the vast Colorado sky, and Emma Grace Hartwell fell asleep to the sound of coyotes singing in the distance, dreaming of letters full of secrets and a one-legged chicken who refused to give up. Dawn came earlier than Emma expected, announced by Caesar's triumphant crowing and the gentle sounds of ranch life stirring to activity. She dressed quickly in her most practical traveling dress and stepped outside to find Daniel already at work, carrying buckets of feed toward the animal pens. In the early morning light, the Lazy M looked even more impressive than it had the evening before. "Morning, Miss Hartwell," Daniel called, setting down his buckets. "How did you sleep?" "Better than I expected," Emma replied honestly. The simple bed had been surprisingly comfortable, and the mountain air had brought deep, dreamless rest. "Is Penelope settled in with your flock?" Daniel's expression shifted, and Emma caught what might have been amusement in his eyes. "About that, you might want to come see for yourself." They walked toward the chicken coop, and Emma immediately understood Daniel's reaction. Penelope stood in the center of the enclosure, surrounded by Caesar and his harem of hens, all of whom were eyeing the newcomer with obvious fascination. Despite her missing leg, Penelope commanded attention through sheer force of personality, holding herself with the dignity of visiting royalty. "Caesar's completely smitten," Daniel observed. "Been showing off for her since before sunrise. And the hens can't decide whether to be jealous or impressed." Emma watched as Caesar performed an elaborate courtship dance around Penelope, who accepted his attention with regal composure. The sight was both touching and amusing, a reminder that even chickens could find acceptance in new circumstances. "She's always been good at making friends," Emma said softly. "Unlike her owner?" Daniel asked perceptively. Emma flushed. "I've never been particularly social. Even in Philadelphia, I preferred books to parties." "Nothing wrong with that," Daniel said, beginning to scatter feed for the birds. "Books don't judge you or spread gossip behind your back." The comment revealed more about Daniel's own experiences than Emma suspected he'd intended. She found herself wondering what had shaped his obvious preference for solitude. After helping with the morning chores, they rode out toward the abandoned Hartwell property. Emma had borrowed a divided skirt from her traveling clothes, though she still felt awkward on horseback compared to Daniel's effortless grace. The morning was crisp and clear, with the kind of brilliant blue sky that seemed to exist only in the Western Territories. "Tell me about the other early settlers," Emma said as they rode. "Who else was here when Theodore arrived?" "Not many," Daniel replied. "My grandfather, Samuel McReynolds, was one of the first. He staked his claim about 5 miles south of Theodore's place in 1852. There was a family named Patterson who homesteaded up near the creek, and old Jake Morrison who ran a trading post where Willowbrook is now." "Are any of them still alive?" "Jake Morrison's still kicking, though he's got to be pushing 80 by now. Lives in a cabin behind what used to be his trading post. The Pattersons moved on to California during the gold rush. My grandfather passed 2 years ago." Emma absorbed this information, already planning which of Cordelia's letters might contain correspondence with these early settlers. "Would Mr. Morrison speak with me about Theodore?" "Might," Daniel said carefully. "Jake's particular about who he talks to, but he's got a good memory for the old days. If anyone would remember details about Theodore's disappearance, it'd be him." They crested a ridge, and Daniel pointed toward a small valley below. "There it is. What's left of the Hartwell place?" Emma's heart sank as she took in the scene. Daniel hadn't exaggerated the property's condition. A few crumbling stone foundations marked where buildings had once stood, now overgrown with prairie grass and wildflowers. The remains of what had been a cabin were barely recognizable, reduced to a pile of weathered logs and a stone chimney that stood like a lonely monument. They dismounted near the largest foundation, and Emma walked slowly through the ruins. Despite the decay, she could see evidence of Theodore's ambitious plans. The cabin had been substantial for a frontier dwelling, and the carefully laid stone foundations suggested someone who'd intended to build for permanence. "He chose a good spot," Daniel observed, surveying the valley. "Good water from that creek, protected from the worst weather by these hills, and enough flat ground for farming or grazing." Emma knelt beside what had been the cabin's doorway, running her fingers over the worn stones. This was where her great-aunt's fiancé had lived and worked and dreamed of building a future. The thought filled her with unexpected sadness for 2 people she'd never known. "Daniel," she said, standing and brushing dirt from her skirt, "what happened to Theodore's belongings when he disappeared? His tools, furniture, personal items?" "Good question," Daniel replied, kicking at a piece of rotted wood. "According to my grandfather, when folks realized Theodore wasn't coming back, Jake Morrison organized a group to come out and secure his property. But they found the cabin already cleaned out. No furniture, no tools, no personal belongings. Nothing that would indicate anyone had ever lived here." Emma felt a chill despite the warming sun. Cleaned out by whom? That was the mystery. Theodore's horse and saddle were missing too, which supported the theory that he'd just packed up and left. But what? Daniel was quiet for a moment, his gaze moving across the ruins. "My grandfather always said something felt wrong about it. Theodore wasn't the type to abandon everything he'd worked for without a word to anyone. And if he had decided to leave, why not sell his stock and equipment instead of just disappearing with them?" Emma opened her suitcase and removed a bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon. Cordelia investigated all of this. She corresponded with everyone who might have known Theodore, looking for clues. She selected a letter and began reading aloud. This is from a territorial marshal named Patrick O'Sullivan, written in 1863. He says, "Miss Hartwell, I've reviewed the case of your fiancé's disappearance as requested. While no formal investigation was conducted at the time, several factors suggest Theodore Hartwell's departure may not have been voluntary. The complete absence of personal effects, the timing of his disappearance during a period of increased claim-jumping activities, and reports of suspicious strangers in the area all warrant concern." Daniel moved closer to listen as Emma continued reading. However, without concrete evidence of foul play or witnesses to any crime, the territorial government cannot pursue the matter further. I regret I cannot provide the answers you seek, but I would advise caution if you choose to investigate personally. Some secrets are buried for good reason. Claim jumping, Daniel repeated thoughtfully. That was a real problem in the early days. Settlers would file false papers or use violence to take over established homesteads. Emma selected another letter. This one's from a woman named Margaret Patterson, dated 1865. Dear Miss Hartwell, I remember your Mr. Theodore well. He was a good neighbor and a hard worker. The week before he disappeared, he rode over to our place in quite a state of excitement. He said he'd discovered something that would secure his future and allow him to send for you sooner than planned. When I asked what he'd found, he just smiled and said it was better kept secret until he could register his claim properly. What kind of discovery? Daniel asked, his interest clearly piqued. Mrs. Patterson doesn't say, Emma replied, shuffling through more letters. But several people mentioned Theodore's excitement in the days before he vanished. It seems he'd found something valuable but was keeping it secret. They spent the morning exploring the ruins more thoroughly. Emma was surprised to discover her instincts for investigation, learned from years of helping her father organize his medical research, served her well in searching for clues. She noted the layout of the buildings, the quality of construction, and details that might not have seemed significant to casual observers. Near the remains of what had been a barn, she found something that made her call out in excitement. Daniel, come look at this! He hurried over to where she knelt beside a partially buried metal object. Together, they carefully excavated what proved to be an iron strongbox, its lock long since rusted away. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth that had partially protected them from moisture, were several documents. Land patents, Daniel read, examining the papers carefully. Filed in Theodore's name for additional acreage beyond his original homestead claim. He looked up at Emma with growing excitement. These are for mineral rights. Theodore had filed claims on 3 separate parcels in the surrounding hills. Emma felt her pulse quicken. Mineral rights? What kind of minerals? Daniel studied the documents more closely. These don't specify, but given the location and the time period. He trailed off, his expression growing serious. What is it? Miss Hartwell, if Theodore discovered gold or silver deposits in these hills, that would explain both his excitement and his disappearance. Mineral wealth was worth killing for in those days. The implications hit Emma like a physical blow. Her great-aunt's fiancé hadn't simply vanished. He'd likely been murdered for whatever he'd discovered in these mountains. The thought filled her with both horror and determination. We need to examine these claim locations, she said firmly. Daniel shook his head. That could be dangerous. If someone killed Theodore for his discovery, they might not appreciate us stirring up old secrets. But it's been 25 years, Emma protested. Surely whoever was responsible is long gone. Not necessarily. Daniel replied grimly. And even if the original perpetrators are dead, there could be others who've benefited from keeping Theodore's secret buried. Mineral rights don't expire just because the original claimant disappears. Despite his warnings, Emma could see that Daniel was as intrigued by the mystery as she was. They carefully repacked the documents and continued searching the ruins, finding several other items that had been overlooked in the original cleanup. A broken compass, some corroded metal tools, and what appeared to be pieces of surveying equipment. Theodore was mapping something, Emma observed, examining the compass. These tools suggest he was doing systematic exploration of the area. As they prepared to leave the ruins, Emma took one last look around the valley that had been Theodore Hartwell's dream, and possibly his grave. The peaceful setting seemed to mock the violence that might have occurred here, but she felt more determined than ever to uncover the truth. On the ride back to the Lazy M, they discussed their next steps. Daniel suggested approaching Jake Morrison carefully, using Emma's family connection to Theodore as an introduction. They also agreed to research the current ownership of the mineral rights Theodore had claimed, though Daniel warned that such records might be difficult to access. "There's something else we should consider," Daniel said as they neared his ranch. If Theodore was killed for mineral rights, the person responsible would have had to file new claims or transfer Theodore's claims to themselves. That kind of paperwork leaves a trail. Emma nodded eagerly. Cordelia mentions the Territorial Land Office in several of her letters. She tried to research the claims but was told that some records had been lost or destroyed. "Convenient," Daniel said dryly. That afternoon, while Daniel attended to ranch business, Emma organized Cordelia's letters chronologically and began looking for patterns. The correspondence painted a picture of a determined woman who'd refused to accept her fiancé's disappearance without explanation. Cordelia had written to territorial officials, military commanders, other settlers, traders, and anyone else who might have information about Theodore's fate. Many of the responses were polite but unhelpful, offering sympathy but no concrete assistance. Others were more troubling, particularly those that seemed to discourage further investigation. A letter from a territorial judge warned Cordelia that continuing to pursue this matter could prove both fruitless and potentially dangerous to your reputation and safety. Emma found herself admiring her great-aunt's persistence in the face of such obstacles. Cordelia had continued searching for answers until her death, accumulating an impressive collection of correspondence that revealed not just Theodore's story, but a broader picture of territorial politics and corruption in the 1850s and 1860s. As evening approached, Daniel found Emma in the bunkhouse, surrounded by letters sorted into neat piles according to her organizational system. "Learning anything useful?" he asked, settling into the room's single chair. "More than I expected," Emma replied, holding up a letter. "This is from a banker in Denver, dated 1868. He mentions that several mining claims in this area were transferred to new owners around the time of Theodore's disappearance, but the paperwork was irregular. He suggests that territorial officials might have been involved in fraudulent claim transfers." Daniel whistled softly. "That's a serious accusation." "It gets more interesting," Emma continued, selecting another letter. "This correspondent, a newspaper editor in Colorado Springs, writes that there were rumors of a territorial official who was systematically appropriating mineral claims from homesteaders who died or disappeared under suspicious circumstances. He calls it legal grave robbing." "Any names mentioned?" Emma nodded grimly. "Judge Harrison Blackwood. According to multiple letters, he was the territorial magistrate, responsible for processing mineral claims and property transfers. Several correspondents suggest he had the authority and opportunity to manipulate the system for personal gain." Daniel was quiet for a long moment, and Emma sensed he was wrestling with something. "What is it?" she asked. "Judge Blackwood," Daniel said slowly. "That name's familiar. I think my grandfather mentioned him once or twice, but not in connection with Theodore's disappearance." "What did he say about him?" "I was young, so I might not be remembering correctly, but I think my grandfather said Blackwood was involved in some kind of scandal that ended his judicial career. Something about corruption and illegal land deals." Emma felt excitement building. "When did this scandal occur?" "I'm not sure, but it would have been sometime in the late 1860s or early 1870s. My grandfather said Blackwood left the territory in disgrace and never came back." Emma began searching through the letters with renewed urgency. "If we can establish a connection between Blackwood and Theodore's claims, we'd have a motive for murder," Daniel finished, "but proving it after 25 years would be nearly impossible." "Maybe," Emma said, "but we have to try. Theodore deserves justice, and Cordelia deserves answers." Daniel studied her face in the lamplight, noting the determined set of her jaw and the fire in her eyes. "You've changed," he observed. "How do you mean? Yesterday you seemed lost and uncertain. Tonight, you look like someone with a purpose." Emma considered his words. "I suppose I have changed. For the first time since my engagement ended, I feel like I'm doing something that matters. This isn't just about Theodore anymore. It's about finding the truth and exposing corruption. And if the truth puts you in danger? Emma met his gaze steadily. Then I'll face that danger. I've spent my whole life playing it safe, letting other people make decisions for me. I won't run away from this. Daniel nodded slowly, and Emma saw something that might have been respect in his expression. In that case, Miss Hartwell, I suppose we'd better start planning our investigation properly. But we'll do it carefully and smart. No point in getting ourselves killed over 25-year-old crimes. They spent the next hour developing a strategy. Daniel would approach Jake Morrison about his memories of Theodore and the territorial officials of that era. Emma would continue organizing and analyzing Cordelia's correspondence, looking for more connections to Judge Blackwood or other suspicious activities. They also agreed to visit the Territorial Land Office in Colorado Springs to research the current status of Theodore's mineral claims, though they would need to be careful not to alert anyone to their investigation. There's one more thing, Daniel said as he prepared to leave. If we're going to be working together on this, maybe you should call me Daniel instead of Mr. McReynolds. Emma smiled. Only if you'll call me Emma instead of Miss Hartwell. Deal, Daniel said, and Emma noticed that his rare smile transformed his entire face, making him look younger and less guarded. After he left, Emma continued reading letters by lamplight, making notes and cross-references. The more she learned about the territorial period, the more convinced she became that Theodore's disappearance was connected to a broader pattern of corruption and violence. One letter particularly caught her attention. Written by a former territorial clerk named William Foster in 1870, it described his knowledge of irregular land transfers during his time in office. Miss Hartwell, Foster had written, I cannot provide specifics without endangering myself and my family, but I can confirm that certain territorial officials were involved in systematic fraud regarding mineral claims. Your fiancé's disappearance fits a pattern of suspicious events that occurred during that period. If you continue your investigation, I advise extreme caution. Some of the people involved in these activities achieved positions of significant power and influence. Emma set down the letter, feeling a chill despite the warm evening. Foster's warning suggested that the corruption hadn't ended with Judge Blackwood's departure. Others had been involved, and some might still be alive and influential enough to be dangerous. But rather than discouraging her, the warning only strengthened Emma's resolve. She thought of Cordelia, spending decades searching for answers about the man she'd loved. She thought of Theodore, whose dreams had been cut short by greed and violence. And she thought of herself, finally finding a purpose worth fighting for. Outside, she could hear the gentle sounds of the ranch settling into evening quiet. Penelope's contented clucking drifted from the chicken coop, where she'd apparently established herself as Caesar's favored companion. Even her one-legged chicken had found a place to belong in this strange new world. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as she and Daniel continued their investigation. There would be risks and obstacles, and possibly danger from people who preferred old secrets to remain buried. But for the first time since leaving Philadelphia, Emma felt truly alive, energized by a purpose that was entirely her own. She carefully organized the letters she'd been reading and prepared for bed, her mind already working on plans for the next day's research. In the morning, she would begin the next phase of her investigation into Theodore Hartwell's disappearance, supported by a partner who seemed to understand both her determination and her need for justice. As she settled into sleep, Emma reflected on how much her life had changed in just 2 days. She'd arrived in Colorado territory as a desperate woman fleeing scandal and disappointment. Now she was an investigator, seeking truth and justice, with a mystery that had captured her imagination and a growing sense that she'd finally found where she belonged. The last sound she heard before sleep claimed her was Penelope's gentle murmur from the chicken coop, a reminder that sometimes the most unlikely companions could find their place in the world, even with their imperfections and limitations. Perhaps the same would prove true for a Philadelphia lady with a suitcase full of secrets and the determination to uncover the truth about a 25-year-old mystery. The morning sun cast long shadows across the lazy M as Emma prepared for what might be the most important day of her investigation. She'd spent the night organizing her findings into a comprehensive picture of territorial corruption that painted Judge Harrison Blackwood as the central figure in a network of fraudulent land seizures. Today, she and Daniel would confront Jake Morrison with their evidence, and hopefully uncover the final pieces of Theodore's story. Daniel appeared at her door, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing his most serious expression. "I've been thinking about our approach with Jake," he said, handing her a steaming cup. "The old man's been a hermit for years, barely tolerating visitors. We'll need to handle this delicately." Emma nodded, grateful for his thoughtfulness. Over the past few days, she'd come to appreciate Daniel's careful nature, recognizing it as wisdom rather than timidity. His methodical approach balanced her sometimes impulsive enthusiasm for the investigation. "I've prepared questions based on the letters," she said, indicating a neat stack of correspondence. "But I think you should take the lead initially. He's more likely to trust someone he knows." They rode into Willowbrook an hour later, the abandoned train platform where Emma had first arrived now seeming like a relic from another lifetime. The town itself was larger than she'd expected, with a main street lined by businesses that served the surrounding ranches and farms. A blacksmith's hammer rang steadily from his shop, and women moved between the general store and post office with the efficient purpose of frontier life. Jake Morrison's cabin sat behind the ruins of his old trading post, a weathered structure that seemed to blend into the hillside. Smoke drifted from its chimney, and a mangy dog announced their arrival with half-hearted barking before retreating to the shade of the porch. "Jake?" Daniel called out as they dismounted. "It's Daniel McReynolds. I've brought someone who'd like to speak with you." The door opened slowly, revealing a man who seemed carved from the same weathered wood as his cabin. Jake Morrison was tall and lean, with silver hair that hung to his shoulders and eyes that held the sharp intelligence of someone who'd survived by observing everything around him. His gaze moved from Daniel to Emma with obvious curiosity. "McReynolds," Jake acknowledged with a nod. "Been a while since you've come calling. And who's this young lady?" "Emma Hartwell," Emma said, stepping forward. "I'm Theodore Hartwell's great-niece. I've inherited his property, and I'm trying to learn what happened to him." Jake's expression shifted, wariness replacing curiosity. "Theodore Hartwell," he repeated slowly. "That's a name I haven't heard spoken aloud in many years." He studied Emma's face as if searching for family resemblance. "You favor him around the eyes." Same determined look he got when he'd set his mind to something. "Would you be willing to talk with us about him?" Emma asked hopefully. "I have letters from my great-aunt Cordelia with questions she never got answered." Jake was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands gripping the porch railing. Finally, he nodded toward 2 rough-hewn chairs. "Might as well sit then. It's a long story, and not a pleasant one." As they settled themselves, Jake's dog emerged from the shade to sniff suspiciously at Emma's boots before accepting her gentle pat. The old man watched this interaction with apparent approval. "Animals are good judges of character," he observed. "Theodore always said that about folks. He had a way with creatures, could gentle the wildest horse or make friends with the most ornery mule." Jake's eyes grew distant. Should have known something was wrong when his animal started showing up alone. Emma leaned forward eagerly. "What do you mean?" Week after Theodore disappeared, his milk cow wandered into town, udder, painfully full. Few days later, his horses came down from the hills, looking like they'd been turned loose rather than escaped. Animals don't abandon their home range like that unless something's driven them away. Daniel exchanged glances with Emma. What did people think at the time? Jake spat into the dirt beside his chair. Most folks were too busy with their own troubles to think much about it. But I knew Theodore better than most. That man was building something permanent, making plans for the future. He wouldn't have just packed up and left without saying goodbye to his neighbors. Emma pulled out one of Cordelia's letters. My great-aunt corresponded with many people about Theodore's disappearance. Several mentioned that he'd been excited about some discovery in the days before he vanished. Do you remember anything about that? Jake's expression grew even more serious. That's where the story gets dangerous, Miss Hartwell. Theodore came to me about a week before he disappeared. More excited than I'd ever seen him. Said he'd found something in the hills that would change everything. But he wouldn't say what. Just kept talking about how he'd be able to send for his Cordelia sooner than planned. Did he give you any hints about what he'd discovered? Not directly, Jake said. then paused as if weighing his words carefully. But I'd been trading with prospectors and miners for years. Seen that look before. Theodore had found mineral deposits, probably rich ones, judging by his excitement. Emma felt her pulse quicken. Their theory was being confirmed by someone who'd actually known Theodore. Did anyone else know about his discovery? Jake's face darkened. That's the question that's been eating at me for 25 years. Theodore was careful, but he had to file claims at the territorial office. And Judge Blackwood was handling all the mineral rights paperwork in those days. Daniel sat up straighter. You knew about Blackwood's corruption? Knew about it? Jake laughed bitterly. Hell, I lived through it. Blackwood and his cronies were stealing claims left and right, using their official positions to transfer mineral rights from homesteaders to themselves or their associates. Anyone who protested or caused trouble had a way of disappearing or meeting with unfortunate accidents. Emma's hands trembled slightly as she absorbed this confirmation of their investigation. Do you think Blackwood was responsible for Theodore's disappearance? Jake was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving across the mountains that surrounded the valley. Miss Hartwell, I'm going to tell you something I've never told another living soul. The night Theodore disappeared, I saw riders heading toward his place. 3 men, moving fast and quiet. I didn't think much of it at the time, figured maybe Theodore had visitors from out of territory. But you recognize them? Daniel prompted. One of them, Jake admitted reluctantly. Marcus Fleming, Blackwood's deputy and chief enforcer. Fleming was known for handling the judge's dirty work, the kind of business that required muscle rather than legal paperwork. Emma felt a chill despite the warm morning air. You saw Fleming riding toward Theodore's ranch the night he disappeared. Saw him heading that way around sunset. Never saw any of them come back, but then I went to bed not long after dark. Next morning, when Theodore didn't come by for his usual cup of coffee and conversation, I thought maybe his visitors had stayed over. Jake's voice grew heavy with regret. Should have checked on him that day. Might have made a difference. Daniel reached over and squeezed Emma's hand, offering silent support as the full horror of Theodore's fate became clear. Her great-uncle hadn't simply vanished. He'd been murdered by corrupt officials who'd wanted his mineral claims. What happened to Fleming? Emma asked, struggling to keep her voice steady. He left the territory same time as Blackwood, when the corruption scandal finally broke. But here's the thing that still bothers me, Jake continued, leaning forward in his chair. About 6 months after Theodore disappeared, Fleming came back through town, well-dressed and carrying a fat wallet. Bought supplies like a man who'd come into money, talked about starting a ranch down in New Mexico. Emma's mind raced with the implications. He was spending Theodore's money. That's what I figured, Jake confirmed. Whatever Theodore found in those hills, Fleming and Blackwood claimed it for themselves after they killed him. Where is Fleming now? Daniel asked. Jake shrugged. Dead, most likely. This was 25 years ago, and Fleming wasn't a young man then. But his family might still be around. Had a son named Curtis, who was maybe 15 at the time. Kid was as mean as his father, always in trouble for bullying smaller children or mistreating animals. Emma made a mental note to research the Fleming family. If Curtis Fleming was still alive, he might have inherited more than just his father's temperament. Jake, she said carefully, would you be willing to swear to what you've told us? Maybe testify before a territorial marshal or federal investigator? The old man's expression hardened. Miss Hartwell, I've survived out here by minding my own business and not making enemies of powerful people. I'm willing to tell you the truth, because you're Theodore's family, and you deserve to know what happened to him. But I won't put my name on any official documents or testify in any courtroom. Emma started to protest, but Jake held up a weathered hand. Listen to me, young lady. You've stirred up something dangerous by poking around in this old business. There are people who benefited from Theodore's murder, people who won't appreciate you exposing their crimes. You need to be very careful about who you trust and how you proceed. What do you mean? Daniel asked sharply. Jake looked around as if checking for eavesdroppers, then lowered his voice. Word's already gotten around that Theodore Hartwell's relative has come to town asking questions. Yesterday, a stranger was in the general store, asking about you, Miss Hartwell. Wanted to know where you were staying and how long you planned to be here. Emma felt her blood turn cold. What did the stranger look like? Well-dressed city type, maybe 40 years old, with the soft hands of a man who's never done honest work. But he had hard eyes, the kind that belong to someone who's comfortable with violence. Daniel stood abruptly, his hand moving instinctively toward the gun at his hip. We need to get back to the ranch. Now. Emma rose as well, gathering the letters she'd brought. Jake, thank you for telling us the truth about Theodore. I understand why you can't testify officially, but your information has been invaluable. The old man nodded, but his expression remained troubled. Miss Hartwell, if you're smart, you'll take what you've learned and leave this territory. Go back east where it's safe. Some secrets are buried so deep that digging them up can get you killed. As they rode back toward the Lazy M, Emma found herself looking over her shoulder repeatedly, scanning the hills for signs of pursuit. Daniel maintained a vigilant watch as well, his relaxed demeanor replaced by the alert tension of a man expecting trouble. Who do you think the stranger was? Emma asked as they neared the ranch. Could be anyone, Daniel replied grimly. Fleming's son, if he's still alive. One of Blackwood's other associates. Or someone hired to make sure the truth about Theodore stays buried. They crested the final hill before the ranch, and Daniel suddenly pulled up short, his hand raised in warning. Below them, the Lazy M appeared peaceful in the afternoon sunlight, but something had caught Daniel's attention. What is it? Emma whispered. The horses in the main corral, Daniel said quietly. They're agitated, bunched up together like something spooked them, and I don't see any of my hands around the buildings. Emma peered down at the ranch, noting the subtle signs of disturbance that Daniel's experienced eye had caught. Could the stranger have come here? Maybe. We're going to approach carefully through the trees along the creek. If someone's waiting for us, I don't want to ride straight into an ambush. They guided their horses down through the cottonwoods that lined the creek, using the vegetation as cover. As they drew closer to the ranch buildings, Emma could hear unusual sounds, men's voices, and what sounded like furniture being moved or searched. Daniel dismounted and helped Emma down, then drew his rifle from its saddle scabbard. Stay behind me, he whispered. If shooting starts, get back to the horses and ride for Jake Morrison's place. They crept through the trees until they had a clear view of the bunkhouse where Emma had been staying. The door stood open, and she could see two men inside, systematically searching through her belongings. Her clothes were scattered across the floor, and her suitcase had been emptied and turned inside out. Looking for the letters, Daniel murmured. They know you have Cordelia's correspondence. One of the men emerged from the bunkhouse carrying a bundle of papers, some of the letters Emma had left behind that morning. He was well-dressed, as Jake had described, with the pale complexion of someone who spent most of his time indoors. The other man was younger and rougher-looking, clearly hired muscle rather than a gentleman. Anything useful in there? The well-dressed man called to his companion. Just some old letters and woman's clothing, came the reply. Nothing about mineral claims or land patents. Emma's heart pounded as she realized the men were specifically searching for evidence related to Theodore's mining claims. Someone had learned about their investigation and was trying to eliminate any proof of the historical fraud. Daniel raised his rifle, taking careful aim. You men need to stop right there, he called out in a voice that carried absolute authority. You're trespassing on private property. The well-dressed man spun around, his hand moving toward a gun concealed beneath his coat. Mr. McReynolds, I presume. We're here on official business, investigating reports of stolen territorial documents. Official business requires badges and warrants, Daniel replied, not lowering his rifle. Neither of which I see. Perhaps we can discuss this reasonably, the man said, his tone becoming more conciliatory. I represent certain interests who are concerned about historical inaccuracies being spread regarding territorial land transactions. We're prepared to offer Miss Hartwell substantial compensation for any documents she might have inherited, documents that could cause unnecessary confusion about property rights. Emma stepped out from behind Daniel, anger overriding her fear. You mean you want to buy Theodore's murder? The man's expression hardened. Miss Hartwell, you're meddling in affairs you don't understand. The territorial period was complicated. And many land transactions that appear irregular today were perfectly legal under the laws of that time. Including murder? Emma challenged. Because that's what happened to Theodore Hartwell. He was killed by Marcus Fleming on Judge Blackwood's orders so they could steal his mineral claims. The younger man emerged from the bunkhouse, his hand resting on his gun. The tension in the air became palpable as both sides faced off across the ranch yard. "Miss Hartwell," the well-dressed man said carefully, "you're making very serious accusations without proof, accusations that could be considered defamatory to the reputations of respected territorial officials." "Respected?" Emma laughed bitterly. "Blackwood left the territory in disgrace, and Fleming disappeared with Theodore's money. That's hardly the behavior of respected officials." Daniel kept his rifle trained on the intruders. "Gentlemen, you have 1 minute to mount up and ride out before I start shooting. Miss Hartwell's research is her own business, and you have no right to interfere with it." The well-dressed man studied Daniel's determined expression and apparently decided that discretion was the better part of valor. "This isn't over," he said, nodding to his companion. "Miss Hartwell would be wise to consider our offer carefully. Historical investigations can be dangerous for everyone involved." The two men walked to their horses, mounted, and rode away at a leisurely pace that was clearly intended to demonstrate they weren't intimidated. But Emma noticed that the well-dressed man kept looking back over his shoulder, as if memorizing the layout of the ranch for future reference. After they'd disappeared from sight, Daniel lowered his rifle and turned to Emma. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," Emma said, though her hands were still shaking slightly. "But they found some of the letters. I hope they weren't important ones." They hurried to the bunkhouse to assess the damage. The intruders had been thorough but not destructive, searching through Emma's belongings with professional efficiency. Most of Cordelia's letters were still in Emma's saddlebags, which had been with them during their visit to Jake Morrison, but about 30 letters had been taken. They were looking for something specific, Daniel observed, examining the scattered papers that had been left behind. Documents that would prove Theodore's legal claim to those mineral rights. Emma sat on the bed, overwhelmed by the realization that their investigation had put them in genuine danger. "Daniel, maybe Jake was right. Maybe I should take what I've learned and leave Colorado. Go back to Philadelphia where it's safe." Daniel sat beside her, his expression serious but gentle. "Emma, is that what you want to do?" "I don't know," she admitted. "Part of me wants to run, to avoid any more confrontation or danger. But another part of me feels like I owe it to Theodore and Cordelia to see this through to the end. What does your heart tell you?" Emma looked around the simple room that had become her temporary home, thinking about all that had happened since her arrival in Colorado. She'd found purpose here, and courage she hadn't known she possessed. She'd also found partnership with a man who'd proven himself trustworthy and caring. "My heart tells me that running away won't solve anything," she said finally. "Those men will still have Theodore's stolen wealth, and his murder will remain unpunished. I can't live with that." Daniel nodded, and Emma saw approval in his eyes. "Then we keep investigating, but we do it smarter. No more leaving important documents unguarded, and no more traveling alone." Over the next hour, they developed a new strategy for their investigation. Emma would organize and copy the most important letters, hiding duplicates in multiple locations. Daniel would discreetly contact federal marshals, seeking official support for their investigation into territorial corruption. They also discussed the need for additional evidence to support their accusations. Jake Morrison's testimony, while convincing, wouldn't be enough to bring criminal charges after 25 years. They needed documentation that directly linked Blackwood and Fleming to Theodore's murder and the theft of his mineral claims. "The Territorial Land Office records," Emma said suddenly. "If Fleming transferred Theodore's claims to himself or associates, there would be paperwork. Official documents with signatures and dates." Daniel nodded thoughtfully. "Those records should be in the Territorial Archives in Colorado Springs, but getting access to them might be tricky, especially if corrupt officials are still protecting the evidence." "Then we'll need to be creative about how we approach it," Emma said, her mind already working on possibilities. That evening, as they sat on the ranch house porch discussing their plans, Emma found herself studying Daniel's profile in the lamplight. Over the past few days, he'd evolved from reluctant helper to trusted partner to something that felt like much more. His steady presence had given her strength to face dangers she'd never imagined confronting. "Daniel," she said quietly, "why are you doing this? Helping me investigate Theodore's murder? Putting yourself at risk? You could have sent me away that first day and avoided all this trouble." Daniel was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than usual. "Emma, when you first arrived here with your suitcase full of letters and that one-legged chicken, I saw something in you that reminded me of Theodore. A determination to build something meaningful, even when the odds were against you." He turned to look at her directly. "I also saw someone who deserved better than what life had handed her." Emma felt warmth spread through her chest at his words. "I've never had anyone fight for me before," she said softly. "Well, you do now," Daniel replied, reaching over to take her hand. "And I intend to see this through to the end, whatever that might be." The simple declaration, spoken without drama or flourish, meant more to Emma than all the elaborate protestations of love she'd heard from her former fiancé. Daniel's commitment was proven through actions rather than words, demonstrated by his willingness to stand with her against unknown dangers. As they sat together in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge in Colorado's vast sky, Emma reflected on how completely her life had changed. A week ago, she'd been a disgraced spinster fleeing Philadelphia with nothing but disappointment and a one-legged chicken. Now she was an investigator seeking justice for a murdered ancestor, supported by a man whose quiet strength had become essential to her happiness. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as they continued pursuing the truth about Theodore Hartwell's fate. There would likely be more confrontations with those who preferred the past to remain buried, and possibly greater dangers than they'd yet faced. But Emma no longer felt afraid or uncertain about her future. She'd found her purpose in seeking justice for Theodore and Cordelia. She discovered courage she hadn't known she possessed. Most importantly, she'd found someone who valued her for her determination and spirit rather than her social connections or dowry. The investigation would continue, and Emma was confident they would eventually uncover enough evidence to expose Theodore's murderers and reclaim his stolen mineral rights. But regardless of what they discovered, she'd already found what she'd been searching for without knowing it. A place where she belonged and someone who appreciated the person she truly was. As if reading her thoughts, Daniel squeezed her hand gently. "Emma," he said, his voice carrying a warmth that made her heart flutter. "Stay. Please. Not just until we solve Theodore's murder, but permanently. Build a life here with me." Emma looked into his earnest face, seeing not just attraction but genuine affection and respect. "Even with a one-legged chicken?" she asked, managing to keep her tone light, despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her. Daniel's rare smile appeared, transforming his usually serious expression. "Especially with a one-legged chicken. After all, she's the one who brought you here in the first place." From the chicken coop came Penelope's contented murmur, as if the hen approved of the conversation. Emma laughed, feeling joy bubble up from someplace deep inside her heart. "Then I'll stay," she said simply. "Theodore's mystery brought us together, but our future is what we make of it." Daniel leaned over and kissed her gently, sealing their commitment under Colorado's star-filled sky. Tomorrow they would continue seeking justice for the past, but tonight was about embracing the future they would build together. In the distance, a coyote howled its ancient song to the moon, and Emma Grace Hartwell knew she was finally home. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.